Good afternoon. I'm happy to be with you here today and to be here in the McFarland Hubbard House of the Humanities Council. I have a fond place in my heart for this house as I grew up coming here with my grandmother, who was a great friend of Elizabeth Hubbard. So to be back here always makes me happy. So I'm Nancy Bruns, and I am the co-founder and CEO of JQ Dickinson Salt Works. So I am honored to be in the company of the other lecturers in the series, and I just want to say up front, I'm not an academic, I'm not an historian, I'm not a geologist, I'm not a chemist, I'm not a biologist. I'm a chef, and I'm a business owner, and everything that you'll hear today is what I've gotten on-the-job training, and also what I've learned by researching my family's history. So I'm glad to be with you, and I'm glad to share what I know about the salt industry, but there are professionals out there who can expand on a lot of things that I'll be talking to you about today. So I am a seventh-generation native of the Kanawha Valley and part of the Dickinson family. So why are we talking about salt? Salt is something that's always around. We sort of take it for granted. It's always in the cupboard or on the table, and most people don't even give it the time of day. But without salt, we would not be able to live. Salt is important and necessary for our bodies to thrive. Salt regulates fluid levels in the body, balances acid and base levels, and allows our nerves impulses to fire. So we definitely can't live without it. Salt was a commodity, and a big commodity, and it was something that people needed all the time. If you think about what your life would be like without a refrigerator, and what a grocery store would be like without refrigeration or freezers, salt would become that much more important to you. You would have hams and sausages hanging in your attics. You would have a smokehouse. You would be making cheese and butter that are preserved with salt. People preferred to have salt much more than they preferred to have cash, because they knew that they could trade it for anything that they needed. It was very valued. In fact, the Roman government would pay their army in salt, hence the term salary. So how does salt get to the Kanawha Valley if we are an inland state? Let's talk about geology. The Iapetus Ocean is one of Earth's earliest oceans and developed over 600 million years ago. You can see it on the slide here. And when Pangaea formed, it formed in the Iapetus Ocean. So all the continents came together right where the Iapetus Ocean was. And then they broke back apart, taking that source with them. So all continents pretty much have part of the Iapetus Ocean in them. Here in the Kanawha Valley, this deposit, this salt deposit, has been redissolved by a freshwater aquifer. So it runs under us like a salty river. It runs mostly through sandstone, so it's not a big void of water. There are no fish swimming down there. The brine gets pushed to the surface to form springs by the overburden, as you can see on this slide. And this is how it was discovered. Large mammals would come to the Kanawha Valley, to the area around Malden and the 10-mile stretch between Charleston and, say, Quincy, to find these springs to lick the brine. Mammals, just like humans, need salt in their diet too. Native Americans would follow the trails left by the mammals, these large animals, and they would come to hunt here as well as to gather salt for their needs. This was an active area for Native Americans, and arrowheads are quite common. So if you back up a little bit in our history, we're going to move from geology to history here. Before the Revolutionary War, salt was imported into the U.S., into the colonies from the Caribbean or from England. It was used as ballast in ships, and there was no stateside production of salt at all. So the revolution occurred, and England very quickly said, well, figure out what you're going to do about your own salt supply now. So our fledgling government put out a decree for people to start salt works around the coastal areas and anywhere that salt was present. Now, as the European settlers in the late 1700s started to move west across the Allegheny Mountains, which was no small feat, they came across this very valuable source of salt and all these salt springs. So you may have heard of Buffalo Lick or Burning Springs. Those are salt springs, and Burning Springs specifically had natural gas coming out of it too. So there was another resource here. But this area started to grow up with salt producers. You may know the story of Mary Draper Ingalls and how she was captured by the Shawnee in her village that was near Blacksburg, Virginia. She was brought from that area with her children and her sister-in-law, and they were taken to southern Ohio, northern Kentucky, but along the way they stopped here in the Kanawha Valley to produce salt, but they needed to take back to their settlement. So when she escaped and made it back home, she told her village in Blacksburg area, Eggleston actually, about this resource and how important it was. And she and her husband actually returned to the area, and they opened a little inn because they knew there would be a lot of human traffic and people would need a place to stay. George Washington was also here in the 1770s, and he was a surveyor, and he thought very highly of the Kanawha Valley. He thought it had terrific potential for development, and because of its rich resources, one of those things being salt and the other being the river, and lots and lots of timber. So that was the start of the conversation around the James River Canal and the Kanawha Turnpike, which would be a trading route. This turned into the Midland Trail, and US 60 follows a lot of that now. So to get into salt makers that really set the stage for big industry here, the Ruffner family was really the leading force behind that. They had purchased land at the mouth of Campbell's Creek from John Dickinson, who signed the Declaration of Independence and had a lot of land grants around the area. He is unrelated to my Dickinson family. So the Ruffners loved this area. They bought that land. They actually leased that to Elijah Brooks, who was the first white man to commercially produce salt, and on a fairly small scale. He made about 150 pounds of salt a day and sold it to the settlers around the area. But the Ruffners ended up buying land all the way from Campbell's Creek west to the Elk River and owned most of what is present-day Charleston. In 1803, the Ruffners started their own salt production. And they grew and were one of the largest salt producers in the area. They were great with technology. So if you think about a well and what that looks like at that time in 1803, you have a hole dug in the ground and you use buckets on pulleys to get the brine up. Well, that really wasn't very efficient for the amount of liquid that they needed. They developed a way to hollow out sycamore trees and drive them into the ground, and they put a man down in them with a bucket and a shovel, and that's how they cased their wells. They would drive these tree trunks into the ground about 30 to 35 feet. The deeper you get, the richer the brine gets because it's heavier. That salt water is heavier than fresh water, so it stays low. So that technique, while it worked pretty well, got real old real fast. So they actually developed a bit that would go through bedrock, and it was called the slip bit, and it was developed by a man that worked for the Ruffners named Uncle Billy, and he developed this amazing way to get through bedrock that allowed the bit to be pulled back out. It would slip so it wouldn't get stuck. One of the problems with drilling wells was the bit would get stuck in the rock, they'd have to break it off and then start over again. So the slip bit allowed them to get right through bedrock and into this deep brine that was very rich with salt. So they built up these furnaces that were stoked with timber, so you're burning a lot of trees. This whole valley was cleared of trees for 20 miles, but they needed a new source of fuel once all the trees were cut down. So they looked at coal. Coal was, of course, abundant here. Coal could stoke their furnaces and burn longer and hotter. There was a problem. You couldn't just switch a furnace from timber burning to coal burning. Like I would assume I could just put coal into a timber, into my fireplace and burn it. But if you have too much coal, it forms a mass and it doesn't break apart. So the Ruffners developed a way to inject steam into the furnaces that would keep that coal from massing. They were really great about their technology. And this technology was shared outside of the Kanawha Valley. People think of Appalachia as very insular, but actually what was going on here was shared nationwide and around the world. It was an amazing thing. And actually the first oil well that was drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania, was drilled using the slip bit with Kanawha Valley drillers. The Dickinson family came a little later in the game. They came to the valley in 1813. They bought land near Quincy. The family still owns that land today. And they put their first well in by 1817. They spent 2 full years gathering timber, knowing that they would need it for fuel, and also they could sell it. And then it took them 2 more years just to get a well in the ground that was prolific enough. The valley was growing with these salt makers, and you had upwards of 50 different salt makers and 100 different wells drilled at the height of the industry here. So this salt wasn't all being consumed here. It was going down the river to Cincinnati, down the Kanawha to the Ohio and into Cincinnati, which was also called Porkopolis. So you had a lot of hogs there, obviously. If you have a lot of hogs, you need a lot of salt to make a lot of ham, bacon, and sausage. So at the height of the industry, 3.2 million bushels of salt were leaving here and going down the river. A lot of times that salt didn't necessarily just stop in Cincinnati. It would go farther down the Ohio to the Mississippi and as far away as New Orleans. So there are several things that made this industry successful. Well, first you have the resource, the salt resource, the brine springs. You had the technology that allowed the source to be extracted easily. You have the location here on the Kanawha River, so you have good transportation and you have good fuel. You have a market that's close enough to get it there and make it economically feasible. And you have labor. Remember, this is pre-Civil War, so you have slave labor. And this is Virginia. So there were Close to 5,000 slaves that were in the valley from the start of the industry in the early 1800s, late 1700s, through the Civil War. And on the Dickinson property alone, they had, over that period of time, over 500 slaves. The slaves were either owned or leased. About half of the Dickinson slaves were leased from Eastern Virginia plantations, and they came with contracts from their owners, which meant that the owners could place restrictions on the type of work they could do. Some were not allowed to go down in the sycamore trees to dig the wells. Others weren't allowed to be in the salt houses where it was really hot and people were dying. Some may have just been restricted to agricultural duties. Recently, the Huntington Library near LA acquired a collection of slavery documents from the Dickinson and Shrewsbury Salt Works partnership. These have to do with their letters having to do with the slaves, as well as documentation of different family lines and prices that they paid for slaves. I have not personally seen these documents. I look forward to a time when I can get to them, and we do not know where they came from other than they were sold at auction. They were not sold by the Dickinson family, so we're anxious to learn a lot more about them, but that is a source if you're interested in slaveholding in the Kanawha Valley. Those documents will soon be digitized, and there is information out there on them. Another interesting fact about the salt industry in the Kanawha Valley is the development of a monopoly or a trust. These salt producers came together because there was so much salt being produced that they wanted to control how much was going to market and the price of that salt. So they developed the Kanawha Salt Company. This company, a lot of people weren't too happy with because prices were higher and it also limited the amount of salt that could go on the market. But the government did have to step in and kind of break it up. So we were pushing some boundaries here in the Kanawha Valley. As I said, the height of the industry was in the 1840s, so 3.2 million bushels of salt were leaving the valley a year, but that couldn't last forever. You had several things that were the downfall of the industry. One was Chicago was growing up as a major meat packing area as the country grew more west. And it was harder to get Kanawha salt to Chicago. You couldn't get it there by river. And there was no rail service at that time. The Great Flood of 1861, which flooded the whole valley. The river was 16 feet above flood stage, which took out a lot of the salt manufactories. Then we have, of course, the Civil War. So this is Virginia, meaning that we were supplying the Confederate Army with salt. And the Union Army knew that if they took out a salt supply, a major salt supply to the Confederate Army, that would disrupt their food supply. So the Union Army came through here and destroyed the salt works, which had a major impact. After the war, the Dickinson family rebuilt their salt works, as did a handful of others. But by the early 1890s, the Dickinsons were the only producer. They continued to produce salt through 1945, but they diversified their production and started making not just salt for food preservation, but salt for more industrial uses such as agriculture, salting dirt roads to keep dust down. They sold brine for early refrigeration, and they got into medicated salt blocks for animals. They also started extracting other minerals from the brine. Bromide was a big one, as well as different calcium products. Because the brine is running through sandstone, it picks up a lot of calcium, and that had value. So as the valley was transforming from salt into coal, natural gas, and then chemicals, the Dickinson family did that as well. So they became more of a chemical company, and eventually in the mid-1980s closed down their chemical company. Then everything kind of went dormant in Malden until I had an idea. In 2012, I had been in the food business. I owned a restaurant in North Carolina, which I had sold, and was looking for the next chapter of my life. I had been collecting salts from around the world in my travels, and I love salt. I had a pantry full of it and loved the different textures and flavors and colors and how they interacted with food. And as I started to explore that, I was also exploring my family history. And even growing up here in the Kanawha Valley, I didn't know much about the salt industry, even though we were big players in it. I knew that we were involved in other natural resources and in banking and other things, but I didn't know about the salt side. So that was a real revelation. And it was sort of an aha moment. And I said, I need to make salt. So I called my brother, Lewis Payne, who lives here, and said, I have a crazy idea. What do you think? And he, at first, thought I was a little crazy, but he was a great cook, and he loves salt too, and he said, well, let's explore it. So I wrote a business plan, started looking into options for producing the salt and what that would look like, and it all seemed to make sense. So in the spring of 2013, we put a well in Malden. It goes down 350 feet, and we hit brine. And today we make our salt by solar evaporation, and we hand harvest it. It's a much slower process. It was very important to us to use Mother Nature and think of it as an agricultural product rather than an industrial product. So we have big sun houses where we evaporate the brine and crystallize it and hand harvest it. We produced our first year about 300 pounds of salt. We are now up to about 18,000 pounds of salt. And we are in 600 retailers and restaurants around the country. And we ship our salt directly to the consumer around the world. We have several different kinds of salt. We have fine crystal, which we call popcorn salt. We have a medium crystal, which is our finishing salt. And then we have a grinding salt. We also have different flavors of salt. It's important to us to keep our flavors as indigenous to the Appalachian Mountains as possible. So, of course, we have ramp salt. We do an applewood smoked salt. So what makes salts different? People ask me all the time about, why should I buy your salt? Why should I pay $28 a pound for your salt? Well, not only is our process long and laborious, our salt is mineral rich, it's naturally made, it's underground, it's free from contaminants of surface oceans, and it is delicious. The bottom line, it's delicious. But other salts from different places, naturally made sea salts, and I consider all salts sea salts because there had to have been an ocean there at some point for salt to exist, or have different mineral contents. So a salt from the North Atlantic is going to taste different than a salt from the South Pacific, or a salt from the Mediterranean, or a mined salt like Himalayan salt, which has this beautiful pink color, and that's from a high magnesium content. So, and then you have, North Sea salts, the gray salt from the northwest part of France. If you taste them side by side and put them on food, you're going to get a different experience. So our salt isn't necessarily better, it's different because of that. We think that our salt is special because it has a great story and it's full of the minerals from underground here. And we hope people enjoy it. So we While we started as a salt company, we have grown into other things as well. Being on the Malden farm there, the Dickinson farm, we have a beautiful location for events, so we've expanded into that business for weddings and things like that. We also have bring-in chefs monthly throughout the spring, summer, and fall for dinners to share their Appalachian flavors and sourcing local foods. We also give back to the community a portion of the proceeds from those dinners. And then we have started the Malden Salt Fest, which is an annual event that celebrates the history of the salt industry and brings crafters and food producers and music and lecturers together to talk about and keep this history alive. Our latest venture has been what we call the Appalachian mercantile. Through this process, we have made contacts with lots of Appalachian producers, and I saw a way to get their products to a wider audience. So we created a subscription box that people order monthly or seasonally that have products, food products, crafts, and home goods that you get, and you can share the flavor and feel of Appalachia. So we feel lucky to have brought this industry back, and it's something that I enjoy on a daily basis and feel very blessed that my stars have aligned and I've gotten to be a part of this living history and to be able to understand my history as a member of the Dickinson family and as a native of the Kanawha Valley. So I will be happy to answer any questions. That's a great question, and salt is really where it started. So people need to understand that we're not just a coal-driven economy, even though that isn't as true as it once was. But it really all started with salt. And while that was mostly limited to the Kanawha Valley, it spread throughout the region. And people have told me stories, I've read stories about people coming across the mountains on horseback with moonshine, with corn, with whatever they produced to trade it at the Dickinson Salt Works for salt. And that they would make a trip once a year to do that and would barter with whatever they were producing. So salt is such an important part of living throughout history, and the decisions that are made around salt have helped this country grow in certain ways, and the role that the Kanawha Valley salt producers played in the growth of this country really had an impact. So there are remnants there, and if you come to the Salt Works, and we will be reopening June 1st for tours, you can see the old furnace, you can see the salt office. There are several buildings on the property that were part of the Salt Works. There are 8 wellheads, original wellheads there. So there was a lot to pull from, and there's a lot of history that we're living on a daily basis. And actually, when we drilled our well, Lewis, my brother, found a well log from, it was the 1890s, and it told exactly what that well, when it was drilled, what it went through. You know, it went through coal, it went through water, it went through shale, it went through granite, limestone, sandstone at these different levels, and we could follow along exactly when we drilled our well. So that was pretty exciting to live that history. And we have a lot of documents from our ancestors, correspondence, employee records, and things like that, mostly 1890s forward. So it's fascinating to have that history and grow right along with it. I wouldn't say it helps on a day-to-day basis, but we do have things that are inspiring. And in fact, there is a little pamphlet that I guess they would give out about how to cure a ham. And so I have a ham curing. I'm on my second ham now, locally grown pork, and use those proportions. They knew what they were doing when it came to making ham, and it was too valuable to mess up. So I use those proportions too, and it works really well. But it's an interesting place, and I feel really lucky to be able to go there on a daily basis because you have all this history around you. And 7 generations of people who were successful, people who had problems, people that ran into issues in business, but they overcame it. And business is difficult. We're in a very difficult position right now, but it's, we've had a fire, they had fires. It's you're inspired and you learn to move forward, and it'll be okay. You just keep fighting the fight. I don't know specifically. I know that, yes, they were destroyed. The salt works were destroyed, and my great-great-grandfather, John Quincy Dickinson, who was living in Bedford County, Virginia, where the Dickinson family came from, moved after he was actually a prisoner of war during the Civil War. But after he was released, he came to the Kanawha Valley to rebuild the salt works. So I know that they were destroyed and they were out of production until about 1867 is when they got back going again. Oh, it was the vast majority. I don't know exactly how many non-slave workers there were, but I know that was the vast majority. And so not only were these slaves producing salt, they were producing food. So you had agricultural slaves and fields and growing the food and minding the livestock and things like that, as well as working in the salt works. So, and the Dickinson property also had a general store which sold products. I don't know if that started during slavery or after. We do have some record books of that, but they're about late 1890s. But I do know about half of the slaves were leased and half were owned. Um, 30 to 40 feet. And then when they developed this drill bit, they could go deeper, and they started to use smaller trees that they would hollow out and lash together to be piping. And then they moved into metal piping, copper or iron, as the industry progressed. It was under a tremendous amount of pressure, so once you pierced that strata, it's actually coming up quite ferociously, actually. We do have a pump in our well. Just as backup, we turn it on. But it really, when we hit it, it was a gusher. And it was hard to control until we got it capped. So it's under a tremendous amount of pressure, and that's why you have these springs popping up. It's basically a pressure valve. Actually, our well is quite shallow compared to where they got eventually. Their deepest wells, I think, were around 1,000 feet. Now, if you go that deep, you're going to get into other contaminants, I would call them, such as oil, which they would just pitch into the river. And actually, the Kanawha River was called Old Greasy because of all the oil that was being dumped into it from the salt industry. Then you also have natural gas, which occasionally we'll get a little natural gas burn off. We can smell it, and then it just kind of dissipates, but not much. but we didn't want to go deeper and get into oil as a food product. So our brine is about 4 to 4.5% salinity, which is slightly more salty than an ocean. They were getting brine that was 8 to 10% salinity. So we just didn't want to contaminate the brine. Plus the process of drilling through that, we'd have to keep disposing of that salt water that we had already punctured. So it was getting quite expensive to keep hauling that away. Yes, so our salt, I think there are a couple of things that affected it. One, that we wanted to have this low environmental footprint. Two, that with our process, you have to work around some things that come in the brine naturally. So iron is naturally in the brine. So if we were to make the salt with that iron in the brine, it would actually be red salt, and it was known as Great Kanawha red salt. Now, you think about palates, our taste buds and how they've developed over the years. We're much pickier eaters now than we were, 200 years ago. So we don't like metallic flavors in our food. So we pull that iron out, and they started to take the iron out too. We also let the calcium carbonate precipitate out as well, and then we move the brine off of that. So the process is definitely slower. We let Mother Nature do it, and we are, kind of a little more hands-on. It's a 6-week process as opposed to a few-day process. Yes, they did. I can't remember the names of the companies that they were selling to, but we have all those records. But they were selling the bromine, and they were selling calcium products to several different chemical companies in the valley. And that's why, you have Dow and DuPont and Union Carbide and FMC came here because of this brine, and they could make all kinds of things with it. So it's an interesting evolution of an industry.